In the first 3 episodes in this series, we've seen impressive examples of community work, reconciliation and peace building. But we've also heard about real problems, of deprived communities that feel they've seen little of any peace dividend. So in this 4th episode, I'm looking at the broader context, with commentators such as Johnny Byrne, a criminologist at the University of Ulster and a former community development worker.
I think if we take it at a very simplistic level, absence of violence, then there's been a significant progress in Northern Ireland since 1994 and since the Good Friday Agreement 1998. We don't have the army on the streets, we don't have regular funerals, we don't have bombs going off. So at that very simplistic level, the absence of violence shows progress. However, I think that there are a number of fractures within the peace and political process, essentially around identity and history, that continue to affect day-to-day living in Northern Ireland.
And why do you think that that's been the case? Why has identity remained such a salient kind of fissure in the society?
I think we fudged the peace and political process at the beginning and we never really addressed it. So what you see now is essentially issues that were brushed under the carpet are coming to the surface now, and they're being manifested in, at a very basic level, politics in certain areas being pushed to the right in terms of putting up front issues around flags, issues around the past, issues around parades, as opposed to issues around health, education, social welfare reform.
Policing was one issue that was dealt with in the immediate aftermath of the agreement, and internationally it was high profile, and a lot of money and political effort was expanded on it, and I think it'd be broadly fair to say it's been quite successful.
100%, Peter. Out of all the institutions that exist within Northern Ireland, policing is the one organisation that you could argue has actually been transformed. But the problem is that in the absence of politics, the police have to referee the failures that are now being played out on the streets. So that organisation that is shared future-proof, that organisation that has went through root and branch reform, is now being dragged back into the political mire that in Northern Ireland.
And it's that failure of politics that concerns Duncan Morrow, Director of Community Engagement at the University of Ulster.
On the unionist side in particular, there has been a withdrawal from any notion of a shared future. On the nationalist side, I think the project has always been still retaining this notion of ultimately United Ireland. We never really have had a history of unionism and nationalism conceding to each other and actually dealing with each other. And that is something, at one level, we have to learn. Irish political history gave us 2 traditions, both of which at times have justified violence. They keep protecting the broader narrative that we were really heroic and what we did was really good. And in my view, that is what prevents them really facing the truth, which is that we are defending political traditions which are, in the modern world, indefensible. That is why the projects you've been visiting are so important, because there is no doubt in my mind that the relationships that they have made are real and genuine, and they've got a real integrity to them. They get it. We have to make a future together. But that stuff on the ground, which has huge potential and has taken people quite a long way, now can only progress to the next level with political support.
And for Stephen McCaffrey, editor of the investigative news website The Detail, it is not just the Stormont government that is to blame.
Perhaps the key problem is that the efforts to deal with those huge issues has really been left at the feet of politicians in Stormont. And the whole premise of the Good Friday Agreement was that it was not an internal solution. There were 3 legs to the stool. There was London, Dublin and Belfast. The London leg and the Dublin leg have effectively fallen away, and so the stool is wobbling, and that's where we're at. The current crop of politicians in London and Dublin, yes, they've had a lot of things on their plate in relation to the economy, but nevertheless, Northern Ireland didn't get independence in 98. It got a peace agreement which they are signed up to as sovereign governments, yet they are not engaged at all. They're both looking the other way, and problems here are developing. And there are 2 other big issues that are driving the agenda, and in a way which politics can't control. And those 2 issues for me are deprivation. The same communities that bore the heaviest burden of violence and death during the Troubles are the same communities which are now burdened by continuing deprivation, and in addition, really seismic shifts in the census here. When Northern Ireland was created, it had a very large Protestant majority and a Catholic minority. In the census of December 2012, well, that's when the results were released, actually just days before the flags were erupted at City Hall, It showed that for the first time the Protestant population had fallen below 50%. It is now at 48%. The Catholic population is at 45%. Most older people are Protestant, most younger people are Catholic. So there is a shift here. Now, that shift means that Northern Ireland no longer has a majority community. It is now a community of minorities. And if that was managed properly politically, you could argue that that would lead towards the notion that this has to be a shared future. But in the absence of any proper planning from London and Dublin, and they're the only people in a position to plan for these kind of big seismic kind of moves in society, it's probably something that could fuel concerns, anxiety, and which will be manifested, in a negative way politically and potentially on the streets.
And that's precisely what Mark Vinton feels. He's a member of the Progressive Unionist Party and a full-time worker in the Belfast Conflict Resolution Consortium. But he's pessimistic about the present situation, 7 years after the St Andrews Agreement that established power sharing to a generally optimistic population.
I would say 7 years on, we've took a massive step backwards. Both communities aren't now as confident with each other as they might have been back in 2007. It's affected my own work massively, because in 2007 I was basically selling to people that we had an agreement, that we were moving forward together, and that the will of the people was the way forward. And now, if you come into Belfast City Centre, you will see Belfast City Centre flourishing, and you will see a great buzz about the place. And if you take a 10-minute sidestep either side of north, south, east or west Belfast, you will then, when you go into working class areas, you will then see that the dividend that was meant to pay off peaceful ways has not paid off, and those communities still live in mass deprivation.
But he doesn't just blame Republican politicians. A divided and often detached unionist political class also bears responsibility.
Working class people don't feel that they have a role with unionist politics. We have seen mainstream unionist parties sort of step outside the working class area. 99% of them don't come from a working class background, don't live in a working class background, and don't know the needs of those who do live in a working class background. When you see Sinn Féin and you see the SDLP, a lot of them live within their own communities and know their own communities' needs. So that has a big benefit for them and a big disbenefit for people within loyalist working class communities.
And Norman Hamilton, a Presbyterian minister who worked for decades on fostering peace in Northern Ireland, is equally pessimistic.
I think it's fair to say that all the socio-economic issues that have been around for a generation are still there. If anything, they're getting worse. And sadly, and I say this as someone who lives in the interface, sadly community relations are at a very low ebb. One of our leading academics, Professor John Brewer from Queen's, I think very helpfully points out that there are two key strands to the peace process. There's the political process, which has delivered devolution and delivered a power sharing executive in Stormont, but then there is the what you might call the social peace process, the deliverance of harmony and reconciliation, peace on the ground, and that has barely started. And I think a key reason is we don't have an agreed narrative of the past from which to try to build an agreed vision of the future. Due to the fact that in order to create and enforce power sharing, the narrative of the past was set aside in the hope that as an executive and an assembly delivered real progress on the ground, the pain of the past would recede. Now, I have to say, all my instincts told me that was unlikely, and I'm not trying to be self-righteous about this. But the failure, for example, even to agree on who a victim is in a way that makes sense to a wide variety of people is indicative of the fact that we have closed our eyes, crossed our fingers, and hoped that the past would go away. But of course it hasn't.
Nevertheless, everyone I've talked to, from a variety of viewpoints, believes that the situation can be improved in the future if some of the efforts being made at street level are reflected in a more positive approach by politicians. And that's what we'll explore in the final episode of this series.